Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this section on rural employment, a pathway to prosperity of other inequalities. Rural employment is a hot issue at the time, especially related to issues of the demographic transition and rural youth employment, more particularly. The issue of employment also makes us think about the dimension of quality of employment, the so-called decent employment that some of the speakers are going to highlight on. We have here a particularly diverse panel, so you hope to get a different set of perspectives on this issue of the rural employment and the relationship with inequalities of prosperity. I'll let the three speakers introduce themselves first.
Thank you. My name is Pedro Azevedo. I'm a lead economist at the World Bank, based in Washington, D.C., working mostly on global issues as well as Europe and Central Asia.
Good morning. My name is María Teresa Gutiérrez. I work at the International Labor Organization in the Department of Employment, especially on development and investments.
Hi everyone, my name is Rita Kimani. I run an organization called FarmDrive back in Kenya, and our work is to enable smallholder farmers get access to finance, specifically credit, and we use a lot of technology in the process.
Great, thanks everybody. So we're going to have the pre-presentation in sequence, and so each speaker is going to have 10 minutes and maybe one more to make its presentation. And after the three presentations, we'll have a Q&A session to fit into this topic. Thank you. Pedro will start. Excuse me.
Okay, so as soon as the slides are up, okay. I don't know, I believe you can see the screen. So thank you very much. So what are the main takeaways of this presentation? Basically, I think that we're focusing very much, we're using, given the topic of these 2 days on rural inequalities, we're using the spatial distribution of poverty as our departing point in order to assess the role of agriculture and employment, in particular jobs in agriculture, on the reduction of spatial inequality as defined by poverty maps, basically, using either small area estimation or survey strata of representation of the surveys. I think one other important takeaway is that the level of spatial analysis matter, right? So there is the Simpson's paradox, which shows that basically you can get completely different correlations depending on the level of aggregation, and we illustrate that with our agricultural data. Another point that has been touched upon by other sessions in the last couple of days is the issue of structural transformation. And in our case, I think our work suggests that this needs to be qualified, as there are processes of structural transformation which can be deemed successful from the point of view of inequality reduction, and others that we are considering complete transformers, which are processes of structural transformation that is still enhancing inequality. Non-farming income matters for poverty reduction, also in the EU. Our work also is partially focused on the common agricultural policy and to what extent we are able to assess the impact of the cap on poverty reduction in the EU. And we show that decoupled payments and rural development investment are poverty reducing, while the coupled payments, which is the traditional subsidy to production, showed no impact on poverty. And that this relationship between poverty and ruralization or urbanization, as the inverse of rurality, it's really not uniform across different levels of spatial disaggregation as well as regions in the world, and that is, I think, is an important takeaway, as there's been a lot of expectations regarding the process of urbanization as being a driver to poverty reduction. So I think one thing that we're showing is that there's actually some evidence that this is a little bit, it can be quite unrealistic expectation. So this is building on a recent report that came out in February on the Common Agricultural Policy and some other work that we currently have at the bank, which is forthcoming. So the Simpson paradox is basically this idea that we can have completely different correlations depending on the level of aggregation of the data, right? So this is a very simple illustration in which basically if you do the correlates on the groups blue and red, you find a positive relationship. If you do it on both of them together, aggregated, you find a negative correlation, right? This is important for policy analysis, and a lot of what we do, especially when it comes to spatial and the importance of more spatially disaggregated data. Right. One might think that this is really kind of a footnote in a statistical textbook, but what we actually can show with this particular two figures is that this is a real issue when we look at the progressiveness of the EU cohesion funds and the Common Agricultural Policy funds when assessed in terms of the NUTS 3 level or the municipal level, the LAU2, right? On the right-hand or left-hand panel, we have basically the progressivity of these two funds at the NUTS 3 level, and you see that they're relatively close to the 45-degree line, but using the same administrative data by simply lowering the level of spatial disaggregation to the municipal level, using data from a new member country of the EU, we find that some of these funds are significantly more progressive, right? In this case, the Common Agricultural Policy. So one can basically derive completely different policy recommendations or even understanding of the phenomena just by changing the level of spatial disaggregation. And when we look at this relationship between poverty and agriculture and agricultural employment, right, to speak to the topic of this session, one might actually think that basically in the context of the EU, there's very little relationship. Basically, it's a toss, right? There's basically the trend here is almost flat. And this is true because there are important nonlinearities on this relationship, and this is something that I think it is important to think about it when thinking in terms of employment, right? I mean, productivity matters, and land plot matters as well for the relationship of poverty and agricultural production. But also there are massive differences in terms of where is agriculture activity taking place in terms of poverty, right, in the EU member states. And what this graph here shows us is basically that there are a number of EU member states, especially those to the left of the figure, in which basically agriculture and poverty have decoupled, right? So basically agriculture is no longer taking place in high poverty areas of their countries, right? While there are other groups of countries in which this link between agriculture and agricultural jobs and poverty is still very much strong, right? And it's interesting to notice that this is not even a cut in terms of new member states and old member states. There's some of that, but you find Poland and Hungary, which are new member states, among the groups of countries in which agricultural activity and poverty has been decoupled or delinked. And we still find some old member states, such as Portugal and Spain, in which agricultural production and poverty still very much align and linked. And this is part of what we're using to kind of qualify this process of structural transformation, right? In which basically the successful transformers are those in which the activity, the economic activity, is no longer a determinant to the poverty. The level of poverty or the level of inequality in this process, while incomplete transformers are those in which basically different sectors still matters for poverty. Now, in this work, we focus quite a bit on the CAP, and for those that are not familiar, that is the EU Common Agricultural Policy, which basically has two broad components: a pillar on direct payments to farmers, which is so-called the Pillar 1, and the Pillar 2, which is basically rural investment. Now, what you can see here, the main takeaway of this slide is that over years and across countries, the cap is extremely heterogeneous, right? The composition of the monies of the cap to member over time has changed, and across countries has also changed. And we use this heterogeneity, this spatial temporal variation of the cap, in order to identify some of its relationships with poverty. And basically, for the sake of time, some of the main takeaways is that for the successful structural transformers, so those countries which are kind of, the Poland and the Hungary and the Netherlands, the rural investment, the pillar 2, are the ones who seem to have had the strongest relationship with poverty. So basically, the traditional rural assistance and rural investment, while for the incomplete transformers, the poor member states in which poverty and agriculture activity are spatially aligned, it's about the direct payments, in particular the decoupled, which are the ones who are not linked to production, right? Those are payments that are all very much work as a safety net. So irrespective of how much you produce, basically you get a fixed amount of resource. And that has shown to have a significant poverty reduction impact. Interesting enough, the couple payments, which are the ones who, in a way, kind of help the big farmers who produce a lot, they show no impact on poverty. And these results are also basically significant and aligned on inequality. We show within region, within that street inequality. But how can this be of use to other parts of the world? So here, I would like to share with you some more recent work that we're doing, in which we make the case that basically patterns of spatial agglomeration of poverty are extremely persistent over time. So here we have Brazil, comparable poverty maps over a 20-year period. And although in spite of the massive poverty reduction during this period, the hotspots of poverty and the hotspots of where the poor lives have remained exactly the same over 20 years. Unfortunately. And the same applies to the US. Now, until recently, the only level of analysis that we could do this was the national, in spite of us in the World Bank having this underlying surveys, for which many of them are representative at the subnational level. So more recently, we started to work very much in the spirit of what was being discussed in the previous session, how to make better use of the existing data. At the same time that we collect more newer data, we started to work on this subnational poverty map, in which we're able to break this spatial pattern of poverty on over 1,600 subnational entities. And using population rosters, we're basically exploring the possibility of downscaling this even further. So if we aggregate and create population grids of 100 kilometer squares, we know that the household surveys go to where people live. So if you take the Brazilian Amazon, right, there are very specific geolocations where most of the sample of the Brazilian PNAD actually takes place. So we are overlaying this information to create basically a poverty map at a 100-kilometer grid. And what it's interesting on this type of work is that it opens up the possibility for us to explore precisely one of the topics of this 2-day sessions, which is this relationship between poverty and rurality, right? And here what we are showing is the flip side of that, which is basically poverty and degree of urbanization, using at different scales, right? In the first row, we have it at the national level. In the further 3 subsequent rows, we have again national level using our GMD data, which is the global monitoring database, and we have it at the subnational and at the grid, at 100 kilometers grid. And what it's interesting is as we move it to a lower level of analysis, basically we start seeing this relationship between urbanization and poverty breaking apart, as you start seeing a lot of places in which are being urban but still have very high poverty rates, which basically suggests that this promise that we often have on the basis of national data that, greater urbanization will automatically drive greater poverty reduction is actually should be taken with a grain of salt. And what is also particularly interesting is that when we look at this relationship across regions, we see it even further different picture, right? In the sense that the slope of this relationship actually changes. While in Latin America, we do find it a more prominent relationship. In Africa, for instance, what we're finding is a much flatter line, right? So in terms of going forward, I think that some of the messages are, I think it's greater intentionality and integration on data sources and information for policy analysis, right? I think from the point of view of the three kind of guiding topics of these 2 days, from a theory of change point of view, I think structural transformation, the process of structural transformation needs to be properly caveated, and it's important to understand that it doesn't always deliver poverty reduction, and in many cases actually increases inequality. And that, I think, it's something that needs to be more systematically included in any kind of analysis of such a process. And that urbanization doesn't always deliver the poverty reduction that we much would like to see, which basically means that in all this agenda on rural development, it's extremely important. From a measurement side, I think the geotagging of information and policy spending at the lowest possible level, it's very important, linking it back to the Simpson's paradox, because often aggregated data might lead us to very misleading conclusions. And I think it's critical for us to improve standards on data sharing and how we do poverty maps using smaller estimations, so this data can be more easily integrated and be more accessible to policymakers and developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Very interesting presentation that actually goes way beyond the point of this section, but it's very useful really to address even this question and broader questions from the conference. So we look forward to see the next steps in this work. We're actually very interested in this issue. We'll now move to the second presenter, María Teresa Gutiérrez. Given the expertise, I think a very different perspective on the issue. But it's going to be important to always link it back to the main topic as a section. And we could see in Pedro's presentation that there is a way to relate to it. So please go ahead, María.
Thank you very much. Well, here we have some key challenges for rural youth employment. Let me tell you that the ILO has in the 2030 agenda, the goal 8 says promotion of sustained, inclusive, and sustainable economic growth, full and productive employment, and decent work. And it is a really challenge description, because if we consider that nearly 88% of the world's 1.2 billion population live in developing countries, and a big share of these are in rural areas. We are talking about people aged between 15 to 24. So this is really a big challenge. Now, here we have also to take a look to women, who really take 43% of the agricultural labor force, but really, as we have heard these 2 days, the opportunities are really limited. And we have to take into account the quality of education and training they can access, but also the most important thing that is unpaid care, and also the domestic work they take. Those two issues are really important when we talk about inequalities, because they are not visible now, are part of the national accounts, but we have to take this as a very high constraint, and also social, cultural, and economic ones. Another issue is informality. Most of the poor are in informal economy. So how can we bring them to the formal, taking into account those pillars of the decent work agenda that are related to rights at work, are related to social protection, are related to job creation, but quality of jobs, no? And other issue is related also to the social dialogue. Just to remind you that the ILO is a tripartite organization. So our constituents are governments, workers, and employers, and it is not easy to bring all them in the discussions and agreements. So again, And when we talk about those left behind, we bring attention to those, the conditions of marginalization and disadvantage in the world of work that increases their risk, the exposure to risk, and also their levels of vulnerability and their rights and entitlements. When we talk about this issue related to disadvantage, the position and the condition of the groups or the persons also determine their possibility to scale up or keep trapped in this area of inequalities. No? So these are issues that we have to take into account to enhance resilience. For instance, if we talk about a girl, an indigenous girl, who is in the remote areas, which are their perspectives of development for employment, the likelihood to engage in domestic work in the urban areas is very high, and it is also a sample of forced labor. So these are working conditions that are important. So when we talk about rural employment, unfortunately, we see that there are decent work deficits. We know that 8 out of 10 working poor are in rural areas. Less than 20% have access to basic social protection. 60% of the world's child laborers are in the agriculture sector. No, it is 98 million boys and girls. But also we have to think that forced labor in agriculture captures 3.5 million. Now, when we talk about collective bargaining, if they are unionized, they are not. Only 10% of rural workers are unionized, so they don't have a voice to really represent them. And if we talk about occupational safety and health, which is one of the decent work issues, agriculture is one of the most hazardous sectors. So when we talk about the rural poor, are those self-employed, smallholders, those that are really without working social protection, no social protection. And women usually work as subsistence farmers, as I said, paid and unpaid workers on family farms, or entrepreneurs running on or off-farm enterprises, mostly also in cooperatives. Now, when we were talking about most of these conditions of marginalization and disadvantage have already been said in the other presentations, so I won't go through these. However, we have to see how to enhance resilience in the world of work. The right-based elements are those protective labor laws, the respect for fundamental rights at work, social protection, dialogue and participation of workers and employers' organizations. Here we are talking about social dialogue, how to bring discussions in the world of work, organizing and empowering rural constituents and communities through the promotion of decent work. There are few tools that the ILO has developed to bring these rural workers into negotiation. For instance, the community contracting approach, which allows community members to work, to deliver contracts, and they can agree on terms and conditions of work. And also, we have to think when we talk about work on dignity. No? Most of these people that are left behind are seen like subjects of social protection, and that's it. But employment gives them also dignity. So when we talk about socio-economic elements, we have to think of economic diversification. And there is something that we have to take into account because the tendency of the of the monoculture, or the primarization that we were talking about. We heard this morning, no? How the world is again going to the primarization, to the big farms, and this the economic diversification is really behind, and which is the source of the food security of the communities, and also it has to be with the nutrition of the youth. Access to infrastructure and services. This is one of the sources of non-farm employment. There's a lot of controversy on public works programs, but which, when they are well designed and linked to social protection, they serve as a cushion for employment creation during the seasonal scarcity of jobs in the farming, and also for income generation opportunity of jobs. So more or less, we have said which is the context, and we would like to see which are those key opportunities for rural youth employment. I would say that also these 2 days in Geneva is taking place an event on rural economy, how to respond to rural employment. And some of these issues are here. So, as you said before, how to shape this process of rural transformation, no? How we are, but we have seen also that there is no a single recipe. We have to see different contexts, regions. So this rural transformation takes different paths. Increased connectivity to urban and foreign markets. Yes, you said, in the morning they said, okay, the lady from the cooperatives in the in Southeast Asia, they can enhance all the productivity, but if they are not connected to the markets, they are also they are also left behind. So this is a very specific and important issue, connectivity, but not only on roads, but also connectivity in terms of technologies of communication that I'm sure Rita is going to explain more in detail, and also to services, no, like electricity, technological advancements. Now the value chain connections. How we can link those short supply chains to the big supply chains, because we usually talk about supply chains thinking of those that are related to the global markets. But we have to think on those small value chains that connect these working poor, the smallholders, to the intermediate market, no? So they can start building and get the returns from their small businesses for themselves. Usually we think on those big markets, but really this is something important to see. Fair trade, supported by growing corporate, consumer, and social responsibility. It is very important, the fair trade. And also the green jobs. Green jobs is, when we talk about green jobs, we are talking also on climate change, both adaptation and mitigation opportunities that can enhance two ways, no? Creating opportunity of jobs, but also changing the thinking at local levels. Now, there is a connotation that rural is not attractive for youth. So how we can improve and make more attractive the rural jobs for youth. Now there is a distance on leisure, nature, healthy food, and then conducive regional and international agendas and initiatives. As I said before, these are it is engaged in the Sustainable Development Goals. Just briefly, how to turn these opportunities into decent work. The first point is giving rural youth a voice and a role in their community. That's very important. So we have to see these groups of from 15 to 24 years that they have the right to express themselves and how they can really enhance their capabilities. Promoting young women's empowerment in the rural economy and facilitating access to productive resources. I'm going to go just through them. We can to respect the time. But in the case of women, something very important is the flexibility of time and facilities at the workplace. How we are going to facilitate women engagement in the labor market according to their specific needs. And we have to bring into attention also the high level of young pregnant women, the youth that has become, and so these are young ladies that are already mothers and they need to engage into the labor market and to have these facilities. Then increasing the attractiveness of rural areas for youth and promoting green jobs, I have already said. Increasing access to appropriate education and training. When we talk about rural areas, sometimes the rural youth have not reached the secondary education. Most of them are just with elementary education. So how we can enhance their employability? So there we have different approaches. One of them is apprenticeship. How they can engage with the private sector to provide them this opportunity for employment, but at the same time giving them in the work training and learning of outside the work. And the last, promoting efficient agribusiness, value chains, and entrepreneurship models. Here we have some models that probably later on responding the questions we can continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Good to hear, moving from Pedro's highlighting of the role of structural transformation and implications for employment in agriculture, and the correlations with poverty and inequality. Now we heard a good set of issues related to the quality of jobs, which is something that also matters for the assessment of whether rural employment is an issue that brings prosperity or even further inequalities. Now we'll move to Rita, who is hopefully going to talk about groundwork, things that I actually done in the field as a development practitioner. So please, Rita, you have the ground. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to be part of this panel and to speak to people who are unlike me in many ways, including age, and bringing in the youth voice, as it's already been mentioned. As I was thinking about this session and the question, is rural employment a pathway to prosperity or furthering inequalities? For me, this is a question that has an obvious answer, especially from the context of Africa, where when you think about poverty, when you think about the rural communities, like most of the population in most countries are in the rural areas. So this is rural employment and creating opportunities for the population that is in rural areas is not an option. It's not. We cannot even explore urbanization. So our urban areas are not growing fast enough to be able to support people to move to urbanization. So we really have no choice but to invest in rural areas and make sure that it's working for the communities in the rural areas. And more specifically, when you think about the African context and you think about the rural communities, there is no way you can talk about that and not agriculture. And it's proven that, especially in contexts like Africa, that sustainable agriculture is the fastest way to really get people out of poverty and reduce different inequalities. So for me, this question was this is, we don't even need to talk about this. We need to talk about what are we doing to make it work in the rural areas. And having already said that, I think now my next major point is, and apologies, I have a cold, so if I'm not very audible because of the cold, I'm sorry about that. Also, as I was thinking, coming from the private sector, because the organization I run is actually a private company, and being in the midst of this group that has a lot of government representatives and NGOs and the different organizations, then I was really thinking about the fact that in investing in these rural communities is not really a matter of a social issue or a humanitarian issue, but really it is an investment that has major returns, socially, economically, environmentally. And hence, even as a company, the foundation for us starting off this for-profit company serving these rural economies or the farmers is really the realizations that there are business models that can work in serving these communities, and that really is the most sustainable way of creating impact. Subsidies run out, governments get to a point where they do not have the budget to run subsidy models. And so for us, it was the realization that these communities are, or the rural population really are a market, and there are opportunities to create businesses while at the same time serving these customers. And we've seen along the way as we do our work that even bigger corporate organizations are realizing this, and it's becoming more than just CSR, but actually building their business strategies around serving some of these rural economies. And I'll speak more about that as I get to the details of what we do at FarmDrive. So I started FarmDrive with a friend of mine, having grown up in the rural economies, but being a computer science graduate. And as we were starting FarmDrive, number one I've mentioned for us is not only seeing some of the challenges that the farmers were facing, but realizing that this is an opportunity. There is an opportunity to serve these customers, to get them out of poverty while actually doing business with them. And so that started our journey in trying to solve one of the key challenges we've seen farmers facing in the rural areas, and specifically the smallholder farmers, which is access to finance. When you think about the different issues that the farmers face or challenges, we like to group them in three buckets. That one is the access to information, two is access to finance, and three is access to markets. And if you don't solve any of those three, then you really are not helping the farmers. And we're seeing a lot of research being done, a lot of technologies coming up, but farmers did not actually have finance to invest in this, in the different technologies. If they improve seeds, if they improve fertilizers, both organic and the non-organic fertilizers, for instance, they really did not have credit to or finances to make that initial investment, increase their productivity, and the trickle effect is that the next season they'll have made more money and hence can keep investing in it. And so we started off just trying to solve this access to finance challenge, and we were really looking at what is hindering access to finance, especially in a context like Kenya, where we have very many financial institutions, both the formal, the banks, the non-bank financial institutions, but access to finance was still a big challenge to farmers. And it was looking at some of the models that these financial institutions use and realizing some of the challenges. When we talk about inequalities, we're talking about farmers, especially women and the youth, not having land ownership. So if the model of a financial institution is to actually require land as collateral to give a loan to the farmers, then that's not going to work. So as we realize that there are these fundamental challenges, yes, these are things that need to be resolved. The governments need to keep working on formalizing land ownership, but it doesn't mean that we'll have to wait for that. So we started innovating around how else can we be able to assess which farmers are actually credit worthy, what kind of loan products actually work for these farmers. And I think one of the key points that I'll also bring on the table is the fact that in as much as they're like the fundamental issues that need to be resolved, we need new ways to actually still work around these issues, and innovation is going to be like a key part of it, and even to bring the youth into agriculture, not just on farm but off farm activities, is really going to need a lot of like innovative tools that also require technology. So as we were looking at some of the models that financial institutions use and why they were not working for some of these rural communities, and a loan application process taking 3 months. If it takes 3 months, then it's no longer the planting season, so I don't even need that credit. So we ended up building a tool that automates the risk assessment of the farm, all the way from automating the onboarding of these farmers using mobile phones to collecting different data sets that would allow us to automate the risk assessment process to actually making sure we're able to disburse loans to these farmers in a matter of seconds once they make their loan application. So we've really have built a suite of services all the way from how do we digitally onboard the farmers. So any farmer with any phone, they do not need to have the smartphones, but the simplest phone that can send an SMS, they're able to apply for, get onto a platform, apply for a loan. We're able to automate the risk assessment process by looking at different data points that range from how are they using some of the telco services. We've partnered with one of the major telcos in Kenya to actually also get some data on how farmers are using the different services, to using weather information, market information, just understanding the different data points that would inform us, will this farmer be able to make a profit at the end of the season, and hence how much credit can they hold. So we've automated that risk assessment process. We've automated, and the good thing in the Kenyan context is with mobile money, we're able to disburse the loans instantly. We've automated the process of recoveries, how we're dealing with the farmers, the kind of reminders, the kind of tools we use to profile and know how to target different borrowers and drive repayments back, and including getting repayments back via mobile money, where it works very well in the Kenyan context. So we are already seeing that these farmers are now getting access to credit. Some of them would never have gotten access to this credit, or in some cases, it would have taken them too long to actually get access to that credit. But that's really the work we are doing. And our belief is that farmers and the small farms that they run, especially the smallholder farmers, that these are business opportunities. So how do we, number one, view these farmers as entrepreneurs? And then number two, how do we actually empower them to really have the resources that they need to run their farms, both on-farm activities and off-farm activities, and in the end, which really will be a major step in trying to reduce the inequalities in the rural areas. And that's sort of a summary of what we're doing, or what I do with a company called FarmDrive.
Thanks, Rita, for this fascinating example of how actually a pathway that could lead to further inequalities can actually be turned around, for a better prosperity for the communities. Very interesting initiatives, and particularly taking advantage of the, the trend that the technological advancement is actually happening, and that, young people can probably more easily adhere to these opportunities. I'll now open the floor for any questions you may have. Can you please identify yourself,
Yeah,
and then pose the question, and try to be objective in when you put it.
Sure. No, just a brief observation followed by the question. One of the first things is that the idea of social protection work protection at workplace, safety nets and decent work, probably, as far as I understand, started during industrialization, when there's concentration of labor, the very nature of structural transformation, as you were mentioning at some point. So I believe that it has its roots, as you rightfully said, in the structural transformation process, the kind we saw in Europe in 19th century and the kind we are seeing in Asia today. But more importantly, I think decent work also has to do with not just with policy interventions, but also with the fact that as to how productive the labor is in that sector or in a particular place. Because the problem with agriculture is that the more concentration of labor there is, the lesser labor productivity is. So the agrarian-based societies that we work with typically do not have the labor productivity to support many of the initiatives, unless something drastically changes in terms of more labor moving towards manufacturing in terms of concentration and into services eventually. So my question then is that if we envisage societies which are largely agrarian still, where there's not enough economic base to support many of these social safety nets and at least self-financing safety nets, unlike manufacturing where really it's not government which puts in a lot of time, but it's the capital holders themselves who put in money for social safety nets. How do we go from where we are today to creating safety nets and decent work channels in agriculture where labor productivity is so low? So I hope I've been able to explain. It's a bit of a convoluted idea, but
Thank you. Thank you for the presentations. Very complimentary. Is it me? No. Sorry. So I have one question to each of you, if possible. One is for João Pedro. I like the spatial analysis, no? And I think this is a very important trend for understanding more the drivers of poverty, the drivers of those pockets of money. And then my question would be, now, how much you got to analyze the drivers of the spatial poverty, no? Because, of course, we analyze poverty at national level. There are drivers of national. But part of the drivers of poverty are localized. No? That's what your data is showing. So what are the major kind of analysis that we have to understand better the geographical focus of geographical, how can I say, element of poverty or territorial element of poverty. For Maria Teresa, yeah, we face the same issue. So I said that I'm Maya from FAO. I'm Maya from FAO. So in FAO, we face the same issue. Now we have also an ongoing area of work on this in rural employment, looking at farm and off-farm employment opportunities. And then I think what you presented in terms of areas of intervention are similar to what we are trying to approach, but we think it is still in the level of advocacy and mainstreaming and enabling environment and training. So this is a bit more, how can I say, a traditional way to tackle employment, but not necessarily result in generating jobs. And then we need to generate 40, 50 million jobs each year for the youth budget. No? And then this is the question now, how much of this kind of enabling environment per se can tackle this? And I think you agree with me that we won't. So we need to dynamize the economy, we need to dynamize local economies and then generate jobs and decent jobs. No? And then a bit of more thinking on how we really can tackle this and through investment. Third, to Rita, very good presentation. And it's related to what you said. I think you touched upon some of the elements on how to make agriculture more attractive to youth. No? Because we know that young people, I mean, agriculture is a response for employment generation, yes, but it's being less and less attractive for the youth. Youth wants to leave rural areas, wants to go to urban areas, and I think you have a very good experience to show more on how to make it more attractive. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Piero Conforti from FAO Statistics. Actually, I have two questions, one for Joao. Pedro. First of all, I do really welcome your call for using more the data that we have. And on the poverty issue, I would really like to have your opinion on one thing that is can be phrased as follows. How much is rural poverty specific? So do we really just need to get better information on prices, on incomes, on whatever we look at when we do make our poverty assessment in general? Or are there some specific elements that we have to take into consideration when we look at rural areas? In a way, I think this is a key element that can tell us how to move in order to get to a point as to have a specific measure of poverty for rural areas. So this is one question. Another question is for Maria Teresa. Thanks a lot for the presentation. Again, decent work. If you try to apply the measurement framework that you propose in general To rural areas, you see certain problems. Rural areas are defined on a territorial basis, so you see certain issues. But if you try to apply them to agriculture as a sector, you see some other specific problems. No? Sometimes there is a risk, at least from the general, from applying just a general framework, to overstructure work in agriculture. You know, is highly pluriactive, dynamic in a way, not really formalized in many respects, even when so how much do you think there is a need for adapting that framework in order to understand the decent work in agriculture? And again, I'm focusing on measurement, just not because we want to be precise in general, because we believe that if you cannot measure effectively these things, you cannot act effectively on them. So, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, a word to João Pedro first, and then Maria, and then Rita.
Sorry, wrong button. If I understood your question, I think it kind of goes back to the process of enclosing, land enclosure. I mean, there's a German economist who wrote about that a while ago. And I think one of the lessons of this exercise that we've done for the EU, that I think it's critical, is that it is possible to actually delink, to actually have high productivity agriculture, activity that, is generating sufficient income, that basically being an area in which agriculture is the predominant activity, it's not synonym of high poverty, right? And there are a handful of European countries that have shown that, right? And both among old member states and new member states, and I think that is something that we should think about it, right? I mean, what have been the drivers of that? And certainly there was investment, there were access to markets, there were roads, there was infrastructure. Certainly there's the cap subsidy, right? But the cap is present both on new member states and old member states. So the cap by itself cannot explain all this thing, right? Even the duration of the cap, the exposure to the cap from a dose treatment type of approach does not explain, because otherwise, we wouldn't have Poland and Hungary among countries that have been what we are calling successful structural transformers. So I think that there is a lot that we can learn from these countries and figure out how to transfer some of that to other parts of the world. Right. I think on Maya's question on the geography of poverty, I agree that there's a lot of that we need to better understand. I think that part of it is being, again, more intentional on having data, not just poverty data that is spatially disaggregated, but also having policy data that is spatially disaggregated. And when thinking about MIS systems, more and more kind of thinking about the geospatial domain with all the confidentiality implications that bring with it, right? Because the moment you actually have a name and an address, right, this can be misused. But we can talk more about it as well on the coffee break. On Piero's point, I think I think there's more we can do on the monetary space. But I also think that the non-monetary measures of poverty, or the multidimensional measures of poverty, have a role to play. And there, I think that, one of the assumptions of any monetary measure is that basically money is multivariate, or it's just multidimensional, but it is univariate, right? But that money by itself suffices to buy all the goods and services that one needs. I think one of the challenges in rural areas is that you might not have a market for certain goods and certain services. So you might have a lot of money, but you might not have certain access to certain things. If you're in Oaxaca, in rural Mexico, right, you just don't have sufficient scale to have access to a health service, right? So I think there's a lot that we can do by complementing the traditional monetary measure of poverty with a multidimensional measure of poverty, and having monetary poverty as one of the dimensions of multidimensional poverty. Why not? right? You can be, poor in the monetary space, or non-poor in the monetary space, but be poor on the space of access to health, access to education, and access to even taking into account spatial deflation, right? So I don't know if that kind of addresses, but we can talk more as well. Thank you.
Okay. Yes. Regarding how we can approach to job creation, we can talk about policies, but also on evaluation. How we can approach by the employment impact assessments to see how we can allocate investments. We are talking about public investments, of course, which are those areas or sectors. In this case, we talk about sectors that can absorb the most quantity of labor. And this is a kind of a tool that we are developing in 10 countries right now. It is a EU-funded project where, according to the countries, they are asking, for instance, if it is agriculture, energy, or infrastructure, which are those sectors that have this capacity to absorb more employment. And so in this case, investments can go right those places where they can be spent. But most important thing is that we also look at on the quality of employment when we see who are those people that could be benefit of this, if they are skilled, or unskilled, rural, urban. So the allocation of the investments can go directly, and this can enhance productive growth. No, that's one of the tools that we are implementing and doing in different countries. The other means that we are also trained is about in rural sector, which is the role of plantations, for instance, no? Which is the capacity of plantations that have to absorb this labor, but also to see which are those working conditions, because unfortunately plantations go in hand with forced labor. It has been shown, no? So we can see. And the other way is also the value chain approach, how we can create more enterprises, as I said before, no? But this value chain approach is looking at both at the top of the value chain, but also at the bottom, how we can create. And here it is linked to skills development. It is really key to work on skills development, both on the demand, to see the matching, no, with the enterprises, because all these youth people is leaving the school or the transition, the school to work. We have to guide them. Which are those technical camps or those professional needs that are in the context? Not necessarily only in the rural areas. It is a general approach. But for rural areas, as I said before, we have seen that technology, as explained very well Rita, is one of the best options for them. And the other point is employability. In the investments of when we try to in off-farm occupations, as I said before, and also public employment programs is another way to make more dynamic and to create jobs. And when we talk about these public employment programs, we have to think also on not just the income generation. It is also that has to go along with capabilities or training and skills development.
Thank you. Thank you. So Rita, you have the floor.
Yeah, how can we make agriculture attractive for the youth? For me, one of the starting points usually is to take the context of what many parents tell their children back at home. They always take you to school and tell you they do not want you to become farmers. So if from the onset you are being told you should not consider agriculture as an option and it's equals to poverty, then regardless of what happens to you throughout your life or your education, then it'll never be an option. So I think that's one of the that's one of the places we start. If our parents are pushing us out, then that's the only option we see. Number two, I'd also say that for the youth, we are looking for opportunities that are income generating. If agriculture is not, like, we sort of follow the money. So if agriculture is not proving profitable, then we are all looking for opportunities where we can make money. So how do we make agriculture profitable for everyone, and even more so the youth? And it will range all the way from the different interventions from government, from even different businesses. The other point would be to also look at in our context. When you talk about agriculture, then most people automatically think about on-farm activities, that it's really being on the farm and using the handheld djembe to dig the farm for weeks before you're able to plant. But really, agriculture has different opportunities that we should be speaking about, all the way from input suppliers to logistics to marketing. There's so many opportunities along the value chain, or sort of, that agriculture can present. And we need to make sure that that comes out very clearly, that agriculture is not all about on-farm activities. And the youth will get more interested in doing some of this other work. But of course, I cannot miss to mention the technology aspect, that this is something that really excites the youth. Then if they're able to remotely farm, if they can control irrigation in their greenhouse from wherever they are, from their phones, then this will motivate them. If they can get information on what should I be farming, what's most profitable from their phones, then this is going to excite them. If they can get access to markets and know where can I actually go and sell this using their mobile phones or technology, all that is going to excite them into agriculture. So there are very many, there are different things that can be done, but just to mention a few, those are some of the ways to actually attract the youth. And one other point that is important to mention is, even as the youth, when we see another youth who's doing well in agriculture, then it motivates and really it motivates us to also do that. So how do we talk or bring some of these youths who are doing well in agriculture and just give them the platform to show fellow youths that actually agriculture works if you do it this way or that way? Those are some of the key points that I would mention.
Well, thank you very much. We have to wrap up the section. I really enjoyed this section, particularly the combination of the speakers we had, the different perspectives, and really the way the questions were answered. I think, having things in the big perspective as presented by Joao, paying attention to the role of structural transformation, then paying attention to the issues of the quality of jobs, and finally, very practical solutions in a way that, I think many of the examples you gave, show basically how one can turn, a situation where rural employment would be a pathway to inequalities, turn that into opportunities so that it can be a pathway to prosperity. And thank you very much, everybody, for attending. We got one more question?
Chair, you have to forgive me, but Rita makes very important inputs that I just like to slightly add on to.
Okay, please, briefly.
Yes, please, very briefly. She said something about your family pushes you out of agriculture.
Sure.
My response to that, let the school curriculum bring you back. That is where we talk agribusiness. We're not just talking, farm implements. Exactly. Let's talk agribusiness. That is, we link it to, the chain that you're talking about, the issues of technology, the opportunities that are there. I think that is very important. When we know what the problems are, let us look for those solutions, and they are there with us, and we can find them. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you. On that note, I would like to highlight also that last year IFAD was involved in some work on rural youth employment, and what you just said has been actually highlighted. The fact that youth may be interested in agriculture if you do the right things, and one with the school curriculum is actually a very important one, because currently the training, in agricultural training in particular, is not paying attention to how the systems are evolving and the opportunities are actually there to be taken. And the actions of Rita's organization actually already showing in a way that the role of technology, the stage of the technological advancement can actually be used to make youth more interested in agriculture and agricultural value chains. Thank you.